In Jesus, you are fully known and fully forgiven and fully loved. This is why Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. If you're just joining us on Wednesday evenings, we are smack dab in the middle of a series called The Mystery of Marriage. And we're kind of laying the groundwork right now. We will get into the fun topics in a couple of weeks. You know, like the topic of headship and submission. So everybody's favorite topic. And then we'll get into other really fun topics like sex. It won't be as enjoyable as sex, but it'll be fun nonetheless. So that's in a couple of weeks. But we got to lay some of the groundwork before we get to any of the really great topics. Marriage, as you know, can be seriously enjoyable. And if you've been married for longer than a week, you know that marriage can also be really, really challenging. Is that not true? I always say at the back end of a wedding, I'll officiate a wedding, the bride and the groom will go down, everybody will cheer, they'll be all happy. And then I'll say, you're gathered here for a reason. And the reason is because you've impacted this couple's life in some way. And I follow that up by saying, here's how you can continue to impact it, because they've just entered into something that's going to be really, really hard. The blending together of two lives, it will be hard, so you can continue to impact them by praying for them. You would not believe how many times after I make that statement, I have an angry woman come up to me and say something along the lines of, I can't believe you just said that marriage is going to be hard. And I think to myself, oh, honey, just watch. Just watch. It's coming. So we all know that marriage can be incredibly enjoyable and yet seriously hard at times. Marriage is filled with immense and incredible joys and yet various trials. Humbling defeats. Is that not true? If you're a man, you have suffered defeat in argument. Even when you think you win the argument, you end up losing the argument in one way or another. Humbling defeats and sometimes exhilarating victories as husband and wife. It's all of these things, and it's more. And there is no other relationship outside of our relationship with the Lord that is greater or more important than our marital relationship. And therefore, it's absolutely critical that we think well about this. For those who are single and one day hope to be married, we need to think well about that. Well about marriage. For those who are preparing for marriage, and I know we have a couple couples in here who are preparing for marriage, for those who are in marriage and are experiencing the day-to-day challenges of marriage, what's critical is that we slow down and we get a brutally realistic and yet glorious vision of what marriage is and what it can be. And that's our aim all the way through this series. And so what I want to do before we get into the material today, I want to do a little bit of recap of where we've been in order to lay the groundwork for where we're going this evening. Now, in the first week, if you recall, we looked at the most critical issue in our marriage. And we saw in John chapter 4, Jesus met a woman who had identified and was seeking to meet one of her physical needs, while she was remaining quite oblivious to her greater spiritual needs. And Jesus, what he does so wisely is he connects her physical needs to her unknown spiritual needs. And remember, he pointed out to her that our physical needs, the desires of our hearts, what they're actually doing, they're designed to, and they're always pointing to a deeper spiritual hunger, which only the Lord can meet. And we saw how all of us have fundamental needs that we all seek to satisfy, and we pursue them each and every day. The need for love and acceptance is one of them. And the need for love and acceptance, it drives us. We wake up every single morning craving love and acceptance. And it's one of the things that drives us. We have a fundamental need for a sense of identity, to fully know others and to be fully known by others. We have a fundamental need for security, to know that we're actually secure so that we can finally and fully rest. That sense of being able to let your weight down finally and fully. That's one of our fundamental needs. Another one is we have a fundamental need for a life of meaning, a life of purpose. We all have these 4 fundamental needs that are wired into each and every one of us. And what ends up happening for a lot of people who aren't Christians, for whatever reason, and even sometimes for Christians, is they look to a fallen and finite spouse to meet their fundamental needs. And when you do that, when you give the first allegiance of your heart to your spouse, you're practicing idolatry. And what happens is when your fallen and finite spouse can't meet your deepest fundamental needs, which they weren't designed to carry in the first place, what happens is you go from idolizing them to demonizing them to discarding them. And that happens all the time. And that's why it's critically important for us to see the most important relationship in our marriage isn't with your spouse. It's actually with the Lord Jesus Christ, and that has to be the centerpiece of your marriage. The most critical issue in your marriage and in your life is that it needs to be built upon Christ. Now, last week, what we did is we looked at 2 of the prevalent views of marriage in our day, especially amongst younger adults. And when I look out, some of you are younger adults, and I'm not going to have you stand up and raise your, and I won't say who's in this room is old either. But some of you are younger adults, and there's 2 prevalent views on marriage amongst younger adults. One of them is the unguarded pessimism view, which is to say a lot of younger people are skeptical of marriage as an institution. They're skeptical of marriage as an institution, which is why the average age of first marriages keeps rising. It's also the reason why, I'll say this, I'll say it again in a later message. It's also the reason why 51% of people under the age of 21 now say a polyamorous relationship is an acceptable practice, because they don't believe in the institution of a marriage as being satisfying and secure. And so they're saying we're open to more than just one spouse. 51%, by the way. Did you know that? That's a crazy statistic. I was reading an article on it last week, and all sorts of things in that article made my mouth drop wide open, and that was one of them. That 1 out of 2 people believe that it's okay not to engage in a typical marriage, but to have a third partner in the marriage or in the relationship and pursue it that way. The reason is because they're skeptical of marriage as an institution and skeptical of the idea that they'll ever find happiness there. So that's the unguarded pessimism view. That's one view that's popular in our culture. The other one is the unbridled optimism. And that's the view that a lot of younger people have, that says marriage will be easy because love will come naturally. And when you're in love, everything will just be easy. And you won't have arguments, you won't have fights, it'll all just come very natural. Those are the 2 views that are prevalent in our culture that's held by younger people. And what we saw last week, I hope you remember, is that while there's elements of truth in each one of those views, neither of those views are complete. Neither gives you a comprehensive view on marriage. And what you find when you come to the Bible is you're given a third view on marriage which accounts for both of the views, but also shows you why both of those views fall short, and why the Bible has a much deeper, much more robust view on marriage than anything our culture has an understanding on. Because we're told in Genesis chapter 1, 2, and 3, we're given the most comprehensive and realistic view on marriage. The Bible says, if you hold the unguarded pessimism view, what you're doing, maybe unwittingly, is you're undervaluing the divine origins of marriage, and you're undervaluing the presence of the image of God, which is in both husband and wife. And the Bible also says, though, if you hold the unbridled optimism view, you know what you're doing? You're underestimating the influence of sin on human life and on marriage. When 2 sinners come together, they don't become less selfish. When 2 sinners come together, they don't become less flawed. And this explains why love doesn't come naturally. It explains why marriage is so hard. It explains why any healthy marriage is the result of effort and time. The Bible actually, what it does, when you slow down and think about it, the Bible actually gives us the best explanation for the glories of marriage and also the hardship of marriage. It gives us the best explanation for why marriage is so enjoyable at times and why it's so downright hard at other times in your life. Why in some seasons it's smooth, and in other seasons, well, shoot, you don't even want to talk to your spouse. And you've probably, if you've been married for any length of time, you've probably walked through both of those seasons. Is that not true? Yeah, it's true. The Bible gives us the best explanation. Now, you stand back from the first 2 weeks, and what you see is, in order for your marriage to thrive, you need to come to the Lord, and you need to come under His Word, because marriage is God's idea. He created it, and He blessed it, and therefore, in order for us to understand it and to live within it, we need to come to the Lord personally, and then we need to come under His Word, which provides all of the framework we need to love and to serve our spouses. Now, this evening, what we're going to do is we're going to return to Genesis chapter 2. So you can go ahead and turn there. And we're going to look at one verse. And we're going to camp on one verse tonight. One little and oftentimes neglected verse that we read over really, really quickly when we're reading through Genesis. When we're reading the incredible account of God making Eve, and then Adam waking up and seeing Eve for the very first time, and then remember, he sees Eve and he sings over her. This poetic song, he sings over her. At last, here she is. It's this beautiful song. And then right after that, Moses inserts a line that becomes paradigmatic for our marriages. It becomes a principle that our marriages should seek to emulate. And so this evening, we're going to see marriage as priority. That's the key phrase, marriage as priority. And if you don't make it a priority, if you don't make your marriage a priority, if you put other things, if you prioritize other things other than your spouse, you'll soon find that you don't have a marriage. You may still be in the institution of marriage, but you don't have a marriage. You may be business partners. I was talking to a guy a couple of weeks ago. Sat down for lunch, and he said, it's heartbreaking. I've been married for, 15 years, and he goes, I don't feel like I have a wife. I feel like I have a business partner. And I said, yeah, that's a really sucky spot to be. And we'll see why he felt that way. And it'll explain why some of us in seasons of our lives have felt that way. And it all comes out of Genesis chapter 2. So you know the story in Genesis chapter 2. God sees Adam alone in the garden, without anyone who he can share life with, without anyone he can create life with. And it's the first time we read in the first couple of chapters that it is not good. It's the very first time we read it. It is not good. And then the Lord says, I'll make a helper fit for him. And so he mercifully causes Adam to fall asleep, and he forms Eve out of Adam's rib. And Adam wakes up, and after seeing animal after animal, after naming animal after animal, and finding no one who was like him, all of a sudden he sees this beautiful woman walking towards him. And Adam, when he first sees Eve, he just breaks out in song. He can't contain his joy. He can't contain his excitement over this one who is like him, one who shares his essence as an image bearer of God, and yet is distinct from him, who is different than him in some pretty significant ways, and is unique. And so the chapter closes in verse 25 by saying, and the man and his wife were both naked and unashamed. We're both naked and unashamed. And while the word marriage isn't used in Genesis 1 or 2, the passage immediately establishes biblical marriage as a lifetime monogamous relationship between a man and a woman. They're to have a relationship that's marked by vulnerability. That's the naked part. Intimacy. That's the unashamed part. And an openness and an ability to both give love and receive love. This all comes out right out of that. Now, with all that said, I want you to back up to verse 24. And we're going to camp right there on verse 24 becomes a principle for your marriage, and it becomes a principle for my marriage. And look at what Moses says. Right after Adam sees Eve, sings over Eve for the very first time, Moses inserts this line. He says, therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Now, I read that, and you guys don't look shocked by that verse. Probably because you've been raised in the church. But what Moses is saying here is just hugely important. This is what the Bible teaches about the priority of marriage. In our society, as Westerners, it's super hard for us, almost impossible for us to understand the importance between the child and the parent. Parents, as a rule, in Eastern cultures and in more traditional cultures, they were way more honored in the past than they are in contemporary Western society. Pleasing your parents, being faithful to the wishes of your parent was absolutely, it was the highest value. My sister-in-law is from China. Moved over to the United States 6 years ago, married my brother. Graciously married my brother. She's way out of my brother's league. Married my brother like 4 years ago. But I will tell you, in her culture, the parents are the priority. I mean, you do everything you can to please your parents. Her sons, they do everything they can. Mama rules that house, man. I will tell you that. And in Eastern cultures and traditional cultures, that's very much the way. If you go to Eastern cultures or Latin cultures, you immediately see and sense their tremendous respect and honor that children will pay to their parents. Western cultures, such as ours, has so de-emphasized the parental-child relationship, the obligation that a child has for his or her parents. But almost everywhere else in the world, throughout history, your obligation to your parents was immense, and it made sense. Because the relationship between a child and a parent is foundational, is it not? It shapes you in all sorts of ways. You could probably think right now of ways that your parents' influence on your life shaped you in dramatic ways, both for, hopefully in a lot of ways, for good ways, but maybe sometimes in some bad ways as well. Is that not true? Yeah. Our parents shape us in all sorts of ways. The parental bond shapes you profoundly. You will live with it forever. Whether for good or for bad, you will live with it forever. Well then, what could possibly be a more profound, more of a life-shaping relationship than between a parent and a child? Well, God's serving notice right here. He's telling you exactly what it ought to be. According to Genesis 2:24, according to God, the most profound relationship is between a husband and a wife. Why? How do you see that? Well, because he didn't put a parent and a child in the garden. It wasn't a parent and a child. It was a husband and a wife. That means, here's what it means. And you got to grasp it. The primary relationship in your life, once you get married, has got to be your spouse. Absolutely has got to be your spouse. There's no one else, not even your children, who you ought to prioritize your time, your energy, your effort, your creativity, and your wisdom for, quite like your spouse. They have to be the priority. Your spouse has to be the priority. Let me say it like this. You know that your health is foundational, right? Your health is foundational to everything. We all know that. But if you decide to put your work before your health, what happens? If you decide it's more important for me to pursue a career and to climb the corporate ladder and to burn the candles at both ends than it is, it's more important to do that than it is to exercise and eat healthy and get enough hours of sleep. Eventually what happens is, if you put work first and health second, eventually you'll have neither. You'll have neither work nor health. And the same is true of marriage. If you put anything else before your marriage, soon you won't have a marriage. You simply won't have a marriage. Look again at verse 24. Look at what he says. He says, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the word leave there, it means to loosen or to relinquish. Loosen or relinquish. It means both husbands and wives are to relinquish the highest position of commitment and devotion that they previously had given to their parents, and now they are to rightfully give it to their spouse. Now, does that mean husbands and wives should cut off all communication with their parents? Probably not, although there might be times for it. But it doesn't mean, in healthy relationships, it doesn't mean they need to cut off all communication with their parents. It doesn't prohibit a couple from physically moving in with one set of parents for a season. Tree and I, when we first got married and we bought our property, we couldn't afford to buy the property and to rent a place. So we moved in with our in-laws for far too long, for 3 years. For 3 years we did that so we could get our property and build our house. It doesn't presume that we can easily and quickly wipe away our past and utterly start anew. But what leaving does mean, it means starting a whole new relationship in which the core loyalty is not to your parents' priorities. It's not to your parents' traditions. It's not to your parents' ways of thinking. It's not to your parents' influence. It's you and your spouse creating an entirely new family that must set its own course, that must set its own traditions, that must set its own forms and purposes as husband and wife. After our relationship with the Lord, your spouse needs to be your highest priority. And if you allow anything else or anyone else, no matter how good or important that thing or person may be, to take time and to take energy and to take your creativity and purpose that rightfully belongs to your spouse, you're actually violating God's design for marriage. Well, let's ask this question. What are some things that can do that at times? What are some of the things that can and do at times come before your spouse? For most of it, yeah, go ahead. We're going to get to kids. That's absolutely true. That's the next one. The one that I thought of initially was careers. Your careers. You can give your time, your energy, and your creativity first and foremost to your career. And you know what happens when you do that? You end up sacrificing your family on the altar of career. We like to think we don't engage in idolatry, but a lot of times, a lot of people will offer up their families as a sacrifice so that they can become successful. By the way, let me say this to those who are engaged in ministry, because this is really tricky, because your first priority is to the Lord, right? Your first priority is to the Lord. We're to serve Him first and foremost. And then if you're called into vocational ministry where our work is serving the Lord, you know what you can do? You can justify it in your mind so dang easy. So dang easy. And you can say, I got to do this, and I got to be at this thing, and I got to go over here, because it's serving the Lord. And your work for the Lord becomes your life at the expense of your spouse. It's why most pastors' wives will see the church as the pastor's mistress, is because he will spend all of his time, all of his energy, all of his creativity, give his best to the church. And what happens is that, can't say the word I wanted to say. The tricky part is the people in the church will applaud you while you're doing it. Because they'll say, well, look how dedicated he is. Look how committed he is. And if you do that for too long, what will eventually happen is you'll lose your spouse. And then your job. And then your very life. Because you found your identity in the work rather than in the Lord. That is a real thing. See, it doesn't just happen in secular vocations. It happens in ministry as well. I can remember the times it's happened to me. Just this past year it happened. I went 10 straight weeks working and missing all sorts of my kids' activities. And I told myself I was never going to do that, and I did it. And it happens all the time. So one of the areas that we're tempted to do this in is in the area of ministry. Another area we're tempted to do that is with our kids, just as you mentioned. Kids is one of them. And this one is really also tricky. It's hard in our culture because so many marriages end in divorce that what ends up happening is parents are looking to get their primary emotional and social nurturing through their children. That happens all the time, where the parents are looking to get their emotional support from their kids. It's a role reversal. They're supposed to give emotional support to their children, but when there's a divorce and the parents are broken, the parents are looking for emotional support through their children. There's actually a term for it. It's called emotional parentification. And that happens quite a bit. And if your children come before your spouse, if you love your children more than your spouse, you break God's design for marriage. And when you break God's design for marriage, what ends up happening is it breaks you. You can't violate God's laws without it coming back and breaking you. So when you break God's design for marriage, it ends up coming back and it breaks you. Now, obviously, our children are way more important than just about everything else in our lives. However, and we have to think this through, they're not as important as your spouse. They're not as important in your marital relationship with your spouse. In fact, the parent's relationship with the Lord and an intimate and fulfilling relationship between husband and wife, every study shows that those are the correct foundation for loving and training children. So if we want our children to become healthy and happy and to become whole, the best thing we can do is to love and serve our spouse well. Therefore, when we sacrifice our children, when we sacrifice our marriage for the sake of the children, we're actually doing them a disservice. Does that make sense? We're doing them a huge disservice. And when your children leave the house, what kind of marriage will be left? Will it be cold and distant? Or will it be intimate and fulfilling? And you got to work at that, right? When you're neck deep in raising kids, you have to work at making time for your spouse so that you don't end up as simply as business partners. We don't do this perfect, Tree and I. We don't do anything perfect because I'm in the marital relationship. But one of the things we have gotten into a little bit of a habit of doing is when we go out to dinner, Tree likes two places to go eat. She likes going either to Ashland or to Butte Falls. No, really. There's a really good pizza place in Butte Falls. It's the Historic Tavern. They make great pizza. It's great. It's cozy. It's comfortable. We love it. Anyways, when we go there, one of the two places, either Ashland, and I don't remember the name of the place she likes in Ashland, or Butte Falls, we tell ourselves, when we're driving to wherever, we say, okay, we're going to use this time, and we're going to get our calendars straight, because we're never on the same page, it feels like. Because she tells me things, and I still think I have a steel-trap mind, and she'll tell me things, and I don't, apparently. So we use that time, the driving time, to work on our calendars, make sure I'm lined out, because she is lined out all the time. And then when we get to the restaurant, we always say this. We say, okay, we're going to use this time, and we're not going to talk about our children. We will refuse to talk about our children. We talk about them all the time. This is just time for you and I to catch up and to talk and actually have an adult conversation here. And you have to get into the habit of that. You have to get into something where you're building and prioritizing your spouse, even if it's just once every other couple of weeks. They're just saying, we're going to prioritize going out and having a conversation and not talking about kids. You got to do something of that nature. Otherwise, you're going to end up sacrificing your marriage for your kids. And again, you break God's design for marriage. And listen, it'll break you. When we sacrifice our marriages for the sake of children, we're doing them a huge disservice. And because, again, practically every study shows that children who live in the security of a loving home and they see a model of marital harmony, they have a way higher percentage of being a stable adult who's better able to have an open and honest relationship with a person of the opposite sex. So if you put your children before your spouse, you're not doing your children any favors. you're not doing them any favors. And it feels like we are in the moment, right? It totally feels like we're doing them a favor. I'm just going to run them over here. I'm going to run them over there. I'm going to do this thing. I'm going to do that thing. And all the time, it takes time, energy, effort away from your spouse. Now, you got to be able to find a balance there. One of the guys I respect immensely was a guy up in Washington when I was pastoring up there. He had a bunch of kiddos, I think 4 of them. And his son had played a fall sport and a winter sport, and it separated his family for a long time. And his son wanted to play baseball that spring, and he said, sorry, you're not going to. Because we haven't sat down as a family and shared a meal together in too long. And I haven't seen your mom, and we haven't interacted. And he just said, sorry, we're not going to do it all. You can't, we're not able to physically do it all. This marriage, and he told his son, he said, this marriage has to last. Your baseball life probably will come to an end at a certain point. And he prioritized that. And I thought, my gosh, that was immensely important. I watched it, and I thought, that was incredible. So if your children come before your spouse, again, you're not doing your children any favors. And if you break God's design for marriage, it ends up breaking you because you put your children before your spouse, it ends up harming your children. And if you put your career before your spouse, you'll end up jeopardizing your career. And this all comes right out of 2:24. But maybe the most important issue, and the one that Moses talks about here, and the one that Paul echoes, by the way, in Ephesians chapter 5, we'll look at it next week. What he's talking about here is that husbands and wife are to leave their father and their mother and to cleave to their spouse. And we read that, and we automatically assume that that's talking about physical separation. But that's not all he's talking about. He's talking about psychological separation. He's talking about emotional separation, separation from parents' way of thinking and traditions, and doing life together in union with your spouse under the direction and the leading of the Holy Spirit, and setting your own course and giving yourself space to form your own way of doing life, your own way of shaping traditions, including the holidays, because you're not obligated to your parents. You can say, as a married couple, sorry, we're not coming. We're doing our own thing this Christmas. We are free to do our own thing. We are our own family at this point, because that's your priority. The failure to shift loyalty from parents to spouse, I'll just tell you, it is central in almost all of the marital conflict that I see. It comes out in one way or another, but it's almost always there. I can't tell you the amount of times that I sit down with couples, and this is the issue. Yes, they've left their parents physically. Yes, they've been united physically in intercourse, but they haven't left behind their emotional dependence from their parents. They haven't shifted loyalties. And one of the ways you can tell is, can they make a decision before running it by their mom and dad? When you've got a marriage where one of the spouses or both are really concerned to see what the parents think or what their parents want more than what their spouse wants, that creates all sorts of problems. Just all sorts of problems. Why? Well, because your loyalty is divided at that moment. And not only is your loyalty divided, but the moment your loyalty is divided, your intimacy will be divided also. Because you feel like the person that you should be opening up to completely is probably going to go tell their mom or dad about it. And the moment they feel that way, they automatically clam up. You just can't be as open and honest as you want to be. And at that point, you're just unable to open up completely. I tell Tree all the time, when we're arguing, and we've been married for 24 years, we've had a lot of practice at arguing. When we're wrestling over something at a heart level, I will tell her all the time, right in the middle of the conversation, now listen to me. You don't go tell your mom about this. I'm serious. It sounds funny when I say it, but I mean it. I'm like, listen, and she knows I won't. That is one thing that I am a steel trap about. I don't talk much outside of the pulpit. I said, don't go talk to your mom about this. Don't go talk to your dad about this. This is our crap. Our crap will be handled by us. It's you and me. Conflict management is hard enough with 2 people. Is that not true? Conflict management is hard enough with 2 people. Try 3 people. Try 4 people. Try 6 people. It's impossible with 6 people. You're not going to get anything solved. You're going to hear everybody's opinions, and nothing's going to get solved. So I tell her all the time, when we're arguing about something, and it's like, you know when you're in those arguments sometimes, and it's gone on for days? Like it's not a quick argument. It's like, we argued about this last night, but I woke up and I'm still angry about it, so we're going to keep talking about it. Or she wakes up and she just says, I don't like the way this resolved itself last night. Let's do it again. And I say, okay, well, here we go again. And everything in me is saying, how do I get out of this house? Can I go to work? But you got to enter into it. But you got to make sure it's just between you and her, you and your spouse. When we're arguing, I say, listen, I love your parents, but I didn't make a covenant with them. I made a covenant with you. I'm uniquely wired. You're uniquely wired. God called us as husband and wife. We're going to figure this out together. And we're not going to stop until we get this figured out. But you got to do it together. Now, if you both agree, like this is the key, right? Now, if you both agree that we need to get outside perspective from your parents or from somebody else, that's all well and good. But if you haven't shifted your loyalty from your parents to your spouse, you're setting yourself up for disaster. You can't be more concerned with the opinions and desires of your parents without undermining your relationship to your spouse. So part of that leaving process is emotionally shifting your priority and your loyalty from your parents to your spouse. Now, maybe you've left your parents emotionally and financially, but have you left them psychologically? That is one of the issues that I see all the time. Have you left them psychologically? When the Bible says, a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife or be united to his wife, it's saying you've got to leave behind your parents' pattern of doing life. You've got to leave behind your parents' pattern of doing life, and you have to form your own new way as husband and wife. Because again, as husband and wife, you've covenanted to each other, and God's wired you to become one flesh. That's a separate entity from your parents, right? It's a completely separate entity. It's a whole new family that God's created there. And so you're free to step away from your parents' patterns of life. A marriage is the joining of 2 lives into one. It's a whole new life. And therefore, you don't come into a marriage and say, this is the way men operate, because this is how we did it in our family. Nor do you come in and say, this is the way women operate, because this is how my mom did it. If you come into marriage doing that, you really haven't left your parents behind at all. Maybe you've left them physically, but you haven't left them psychologically. And you're going to have all sorts of troubles. Let me give you an example. I know a woman growing up who her mom never worked outside of her home. Her husband made a really good living. And therefore, dad went to work, mom never worked outside of the home, and they made it work. And they told their daughter, this is how your dad loves me. And this is a good pattern for your home, a good pattern for your good home. And then when she gets married, her husband worked long hours, was trying to get his business up off the ground, but it ends up that ends just weren't being met. And so he asked her to go and get a job outside the house for a while. What did she hear? All she heard was, you don't love me. And they weren't going to have a good home life. And therefore, they weren't following a good pattern. You see, while they had physically separated from her parents, and while they had physically united as husband and wife, psychologically, she hadn't left at all. And again, though they had physical oneness, they hadn't formed their own way of doing life, their own way of making decisions. Let me give you another example. I know a guy whose dad worked a ton of hours while he was growing up, and he put tremendous pressure on his son to be financially successful. He said, the key to life is you being financially successful. And now the son, as a grown-up adult, he puts tremendous ton of hours at work trying to prove himself to his dad. And you know what his wife said? His wife said he cares far more about pleasing his dad and meeting his dad's desires than he does about meeting my own desires. That's the way. That's it right there. He hadn't left, psychologically, he hadn't left behind. And it comes out in all sorts of other ways as too, ways in which you wouldn't expect. I was reading a book by Tim Keller a while back, and when he and his wife were young, and they had a child, and one of the children had soiled the diaper. And Keller had smelt it, Tim had smelt it, and he thought, well, okay, my wife will deal with this. And the wife knew that he had smelt it, and she assumed he was going to deal with it. Because in her family, whoever smelt it, they dealt with it. In Tim Keller's family, growing up, he said, my dad worked long hours, and the woman took care of all of the children's needs. And so about 25 minutes went by, and he said he was on the inside burning up, just completely ticked at his wife that she hadn't taken care of it. And he realized, after about 30 minutes, he said, I realized, I teach all the time about psychologically leaving your family, and here I am burning up, ticked off at my wife, because I hadn't psychologically left my family because I just assumed my parents' pattern of their way of doing life was the right way. He goes, and Kathy and I hadn't come together and figured out how we were going to deal with that. See, it happens in all sorts of ways, and this is incredible. Do you see how important this is? This is incredibly important. You can leave your parents' home. You can be financially separate from them. But if you haven't left them psychologically, then the leaving and cleaving process will go off the rails. And though you may be physically intimate, the intimacy that your heart really, really longs for, it just won't be found. That's why this is so incredibly important. When he says you got to leave your father and mother and cleave to his wife, he's talking the whole thing. He's talking, yes, physical, yes, emotional, yes, psychological. This whole thing, it's one new family that is being formed, and the husband and the wife, they're forming and they're charting a new course for themselves. So this is incredibly important. It's a foundational principle of marriage. A man shall leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. So ask yourself, is there an area of my marriage that I need to reassess in light of the priority principle? Have I really left my parents' pattern of life, and have me and my spouse charted a course for ourselves where we're really one flesh, and physically, psychologically, emotionally, as a couple, we're doing this together, and we're going to work through these issues together. Because what needs to happen is husbands and wives, they need to slow down and they need to sit down, and they need to talk about how are we going to set a course. How are we going to set a course for our new life together and make each other our top priority outside of Christ? Because if your union is going to last, you have to put the needs of your spouse above your own. And more often than not, remember I said in the opening, when two sinners get married, they don't become less selfless, they don't become more selfless. They don't become less selfish. We still prioritize our own needs. So you got to sit down and say, well, how can I meet your needs? What can I do that would help meet the needs that you have and the desires of your heart? And what's interesting, in Ephesians 5, the Apostle Paul, in his great teaching on marriage, we're going to look at it next week, he echoes Genesis 2:24, that a man and a woman shall leave their father and mother and be united to his wife, and then they shall become one flesh. And then Paul inserts this line. He quotes Genesis 2:24, and then he says this. He says, this mystery is profound, which is why we titled this The Mystery of Marriage. Paul says, this mystery is profound. A man shall leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And then Paul says, this mystery is profound. And I'm saying that it refers to Christ and the church. What is he talking about? This is just incredibly important. Paul says, in essence, that our marriage should reflect what Christ has done to bring us into deep union with him. Well, what did Christ do to bring us into deep union with him? You know what he did? He made us his priority. It's exactly what he did. He made us his priority. What else did he do? He left his Father's throne above. And he came to us. And he died to his own interests. And he looked to meet our needs and interests and said, now, don't you see the gospel gives you everything you need? It gives you the deep inner resources you need. His sacrificial service to us has brought us into deep union with him. And to the degree that you grasp what Jesus has done for you, and your heart has been grasped by what Jesus has done for you, is to the degree that you'll be willing and able to let go of your past, to move out on your own with a husband and a wife, embrace the fresh start of marriage, and willingly prioritize your spouse, making him or her your top priority. Amen?